Hi there, I'm Norm Allen. I'm the director of Touchstone Ministries. We've been offering, encouraging, and teaching spiritual friendship for 30 plus years. And this On Further Reflection podcast is a series of sporadic offerings to explore some of the issues around spiritual friendship that we've discovered over the years. Joining me today is a longtime friend, Pekka Varvas, whose subject matter is really going to be transitions in life. And we're going to explore that together. We've been friends for long before Touchstone started, but he's been a part of Touchstone since we began 36 years ago. And so he understands us. He's been a good friend and a good supporter. He's been through transitions from moving from Finland and arriving in Canada as a youngster and being called a DP, a displaced person. He's been through the transition of becoming a married man and having two kids, Serena and Vanessa. He has moved into the business world with his skills in art and design and advertising. Been through many transitions in business, up and down, some success, some failure, and then sold his business and has transitioned into retirement. He also has been through the transition of becoming a grandparent and having one of his daughters come out of the closet within the context of their very conservative theological community. He's also been through the transitions that come with age and stage in his own personal spiritual journey in discovering the love of God for him and for the world around him. So I'm going to be spending some time asking Pekka some questions. He's going to provide some answers, and we're going to see where this ultimately takes us. So Pekka, why don't you talk about the beginnings of your journey into Canada and what that was like to be a youngster in the early 1950s, arriving from post-war Finland to post-war Canada.
Yeah, we immigrated to Canada in the mid 1950s. And I think the reasoning that we ended up coming here is my parents were very, very much concerned and afraid of what was happening with the big next door neighbor. My dad had fought in a war against the Soviets and saw their aggressive expansionism and wanted to move the family and especially the children to a more safe and secure place. And so we immigrated to Toronto in 1955. And as Norm mentioned, at that time, it was still shortly after the war. And with all the immigration coming, we were considered DPs or displaced persons, and moved into a real rough and tumble, blue-collar working neighborhood, and started our journey there.
Now, were you called a DP? Were you just beat up? Did you wear funny clothes? You couldn't speak English?
Well, all of what you mentioned. The funny little story was we started in school and we were wearing the funny clothes that European kids wore at that time, and the local kids were in t-shirts and jeans here. And so we definitely stood out, and literally, every day after school, there was 3 of us Finnish boys who were renting in the same house. We'd get beat up. There'd be a gang of kids waiting for us as we left the school, and they would, just bounce on us. And, we'd go home with ripped clothes and, dirty faces and bruises and that sort of stuff. And my mom is 5'0" and a truly saintly person. And one day I was able to escape and tell my mom, they're beating us up again. My mom, in her holy fear, picked up a belt and went running into this group and wailing away at them with her belt. And we were left alone after that. And so that was sort of the beginning of our transition. It was very interesting. We moved, I think, every year and a half to different rental places until my parents then finally bought their first home in the early 1960s.
And your dad was establishing a business?
No, my dad was a carpenter. Well, he was actually a farmer. We lived on a farm in Finland, and he sold the farm and moved here and went to work as a carpenter for his brother, who had immigrated a little earlier.
And what role did church and faith play in that period of sort of growing up in Canada, learning the language and all that sort of stuff?
Oh, it was interesting. I was just thinking about it before starting this conversation, and I think our family was the third generation of born again Christians. Um, my grandparents were devout Christians, and passed along their faith to their children. Although my father and brothers really didn't take to it because the war came along, and they saw some pretty horrid things in that. But on returning from the war, they were all traumatized, and uh, three my of dad's brothers all came to the Lord as a result of that. After in soul searching and coming to terms with the horrors that they saw.
So their view
So
wasn't that
yeah,
they didn't sort of say war was so horrible, I can't believe in God. It was war was so horrible, I have to, or
pretty much that. Yeah. Uh, so anyway, so then we were raised in a Christian home right from uh, as far back as I can remember. When we lived on the farm in Finland, my mom was a Sunday school teacher for the local kids in the neighborhood. And coming over here, we joined the Finnish church, and we grew up in the church our entire lives.
and did
And
that help you with the transition to English and to Canadian culture, or was there a
yeah, it did.
tension
I mean,
between the two?
yeah, it did. My having a Christian community, a Finnish Christian community here, was an enormous support because we didn't speak the language. My mom and dad basically had sold everything, and we came with, I think, 2 or 3 trunks, suitcases here to start something in a different country, not knowing the language or the culture or the educational system. So it was a huge risk on their part.
And so if you were to sort of talk about how you then, so you're a high school student, you were thinking about what you were going to do with your life. What kinds of transitions did you go through there?
Well, again, like I told you, we lived in these blue collar neighborhoods, and um, we made friends with the other young people around us, and we went through scraps, and we were rather precocious young kids, and the interesting thing is that given mom and dad's teaching and care and love for us, despite the fact that we got into trouble in that, I just remember very clearly that I'd come home and in the evening I'd have to confess my sins to my mom. So,
So who was scarier, God or your mother?
both. And so, but my mom was dear and loving, and we were disciplined, when we got caught doing bad things, but it was all done in love. And despite the fact that I was in terror of getting a spanking from my mom, looking at it in hindsight, it was all done with a great deal of love and care and teaching.
So when I first met you in the 70s, when I was with Youth for Christ and you were with Creative Circle,
It was before
you
Creative Circle.
oh, it was
It
before
was
Creative. So you were working with what's his name, Gray at LePage.
PAOC, yeah.
Oh, you were at POC.
Testimony Press.
Anyway, my recollection is when you were in in your beginning days of the real estate world with Creative Circle. So you were with what's his name, Gray at Royal LePage.
That's right, yeah. It was A. LePage in those days.
So now, how did you sort of go from being a guy who was a Pentecostal boy working in the denominational head office to end up becoming not only a artistic but also a creative talent and then entrepreneur to create your own several businesses in different partnerships over the next 35 or 40 years? What sort of drove you, or what were the core things that caused you to have that kind of energy to do what you do?
I mean, I think in a sense, entrepreneurship is you either have it, that notion of taking risk to do something that you really want to do, or you don't. And I was one of these risk takers. And after I left working at the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada head office, um, I really, I really had this sort of drive to want to do something on my own. And it started that journey, first of all, going to work for LePage in their marketing division for some years. And then going to work for one of the national ad agencies. I always had this thing in my, sort of in my gut that I wanted to have my own name on the door. And it was just one of these driving things that when the opportunity came, I was actually given a pink slip. I saw opportunity in it. And I took a couple of partners with me, and we started up our own business, taking the business that we were servicing with us. And so that was a big risk. I already had a mortgage on the house and all that, but I was at that point, I was young enough. I was willing to risk it all
How
to
old were you?
start something.
How old were you when you started that?
I would say I was probably, without doing the math, I was probably in my late 20s to maybe early 30s.
So you and two of your partners took the book of business that you had for the
That's right.
ad
Yeah.
agency and
Now,
started.
mind you, we did it, really, I thought, well, in that the ad agency that I was with was having to rationalize their business because they had thought the McDonald's business and the Ford business, and they were downsizing, and they were going to have to close our little group that we were in. And so we went to the owners and we said, listen, we'd like to take this business with us, so that you don't get sued for breach of contract. And and so they said, sure, our blessing, go do it. By the way, we'll give you 6 months rent-free space to start your business.
Very good. So how many different businesses? So that first one was Seppi Varvas,
No, it was actually Solway Varvas.
Solway Varvas.
And then we added another partner, it became Seppi Varvas. And then from there, I think I had another 3 or 4 different companies.
Right. And the last one was Drive.
That's right, yeah.
And Pekka is a real driver. Now, and Pekka's been quite involved in us even doing this sort of thing. Our whole social media side of things has been driving the development of a lot of that for Touchstone, which has been a real gift to us as he retired. So what role did your faith in God play in your practice of your business, in your feelings about your business, and your sense of purpose in your businesses?
Well, it's interesting. I think it first started off right after I graduated. I got a job at the Pentecostal Assemblies of Canada head office. And I think I was there for about 5 years. And it was a really wonderful grounding for me to do my work in a way that I thought and I believed had purpose to it. And to do my work ethically, honestly, with a sense of integrity to it. So I think that was a good grounding for where I went afterwards.
Because the advertising industry and the real estate industry, both of them are not necessarily known to be,
Yeah.
sometimes people color outside the lines would be a way to put it. So would you say you were navigating interesting territory that maybe your church family would be suspicious of, or?
I don't know that the church family was suspicious of it. I continued to do some type of freelance work up to a point for Christian camps and some of the other organizations while I was working a secular job. But yeah, there definitely are a lot of gray areas, within both the advertising marketing business, because it's a business of persuasion and putting your best foot forward. And it's so easy to exaggerate and to push that boundary of what is truth and what isn't. And so that was a constant challenge, I think more so on the business front than within my church family and their sort of view of what I did. And so having a sense of integrity and honesty in working in a secular contacts, it was that part I found challenging because I had to try to put my best foot forward on whatever we were promoting, and yet try to remain honest about it. And hey, that's a real challenge.
Now, years ago, you were part of one of the earliest groups of Touchstone, and you're part of the same, sort of the inheritors of that original group. What role did the group of guys that you still meet with play in navigating some of the shoals of the advertising and real estate industry?
Well, it was actually, I really found the Touchstone groups extremely helpful. They really kind of were my accountability group in a sense, because we met regularly and we were able to be pretty honest with each other in the group and raise ethics questions and a sense of honesty and being, Jesus' presence out in the marketplace. So that was sort of, one of the things that I really kind of consider church in that we met regularly, and we worshiped together and we looked at scripture together and we talked about being that person of integrity in a pretty rough and tumble marketplace.
Now, in that early days of Touchstone, I was borrowing space from a friend who had just around the market crash of '87 had, with fear and trepidation, taken a company public, and I was borrowing office space from them. At one point, there was a discussion about me becoming a member of their board as an ethical advisor, and one of the attractions to that would be maybe it would get some attention in the business pages of the Globe and Mail or Financial Post or whatever. I remember discussing this with you, and you said you were opposed to it, and if we want attention, we can easily get it because that's your business. You know how to promote things. But you were opposed to it because you felt it violated a sense of the spirit of what you were trying to do with that group of guys you were with. Can you explain that?
Yeah, I really had kind of strong feelings about the fact that our faith and our journey as Christians is not something to be marketed. Where you have an agenda and you're trying to sell a product or you're trying to sell something. It was really more for me about community and just communicating and sharing something that was very deep-seated in each one of us. And I just thought that marketing would have been a betrayal of that.
It's interesting too. You were not immune to hard work and overnights and showing up at the group at 7 o'clock in the morning on the way home from having done an all-nighter to get a project finished. How did you maintain some sort of healthy relationship with your wife Anita and the kids and all of that sort of stuff? Because you were in the middle of an extremely demanding business environment, and it was your own business and your own money. So that has a way of putting more pressure on you than just if you're working on a project for somebody else.
Yeah, it was probably, I would say, it was the biggest challenge of my life. Trying to have a balance in between starting up a business, literally with no capital to be able to invest it into it. So it was all sweat equity, and working around the clock to be able to make the business viable. And so, Anita, my wife, was just a saint through that process because I was so tired and so obsessed with starting up the business that that I ended up sacrificing a lot for that. And I had huge remorse, later on over some of that because the children weren't seeing me, and I had to. And there came a point where I really had to start changing my life, my schedule, so that I made room for them. In addition to the, really heavy and deadline-oriented business that we were in.
Yeah, one of the things I remember is you seem to be very actively involved in ringette. That you were traveling everywhere, they were very good ringette players, and they were involved in high level competition, and you were just everywhere.
Yeah.
Was that part of that process?
It was very much, yeah. I thought I need to commit myself to something, to things with my family. And so both our girls were very athletic and showed a real aptitude for sports. And so it wasn't just ringette, which was sort of girls hockey, they called it at that time. It was baseball, and it was field hockey, and it was ice hockey, and all of those. And so I definitely did encourage it, but that was the one time that I could really be with them. I was sat on the coach's bench and so we would have good conversations about it. And if we had to go to a tournament out of town, you've got to spend 2 hours, 3 hours, sometimes as much as 5 hours in a car, and you got to talk about something. And so, we had some really good in-depth soulful conversations and just sharing through those times.
Right. Now, how long have you been married to Anita?
48 years.
All right. And you are coming up to 50 in a couple, so you'll have all kinds of expensive plans, no doubt, for that. Now, you've been through transitions in that family setting. So you've gone from being a parent to father of the bride to grandparent on one side, and then within the context of your conservative background, you had one daughter who has come out as a gay person, and that was a sort of an interesting time for you, as I recall our conversation some years ago, as you tried to figure out, what do I do about something that was a subject that was framed in very black and white and sometimes harsh terms within the tribes in which we were raised. And yet what we were raised with didn't seem to fit the situation that you were faced with. Would that be a fair?
Yeah, it is. But Norm, I'd have to say you were a great counsel for me, as was our Touchstone breakfast group.
Right, Michael and
you were a great sounding board and gave great advice and also referrals for it. I started having a premonition at one time. Vanessa, we grew up in the church. Our children went to Sunday school. They went to youth group. They were leaders in their youth group. And Vanessa in particular, she was in the worship group, and she went on missions trips and that, through her youth, and was baptized on her own request. And so, we were a church family, and we shared our deep faith with them, and they were a part of it. But what happens is, as you become adult, you really have to take ownership of your faith in an entirely different way and come to terms with who you are, and it takes some time. I think Vanessa was about 30 when she finally came to that realization that her sexual orientation was different. She had been able to travel around the world and studied in China and in England for her master's, and being away from home and being exposed to a world outside our particular bubble really kind of opened her eyes in a different way. And when she shared with me first that I had already talked with you, Norm, and I had sought some counseling because I really kind of had the sense that something was going to happen when she came home for Christmas. And so I think I was sort of prepared for it, in that I needed to know how to respond if she did share with me. And so we went for that walk in the snow, and she did tell me that, that she was gay. And so the advice that I had gotten was, whatever you do, the first words that you say are going to be the things she remembers for life. And so all I can tell you is we just cried and we hugged. And I told her I love her as much now as I did yesterday. It's still an emotional thing. But the tough part for me was she literally had to leave for the airport because she was heading back to London because she was still She was still in school in Sheffield. And she said, before we got back to the house, would you tell mom? And so I took her to the airport, and it took about a week before I had the courage to be able to share with Anita, and it completely blindsided her. She was totally unprepared for it. And Norm, you had given us a counselor's name, and I had already seen the counselor, and I had set up appointments for us to get some counseling on how to deal with this. It was a Christian counselor that was, and she did a wonderful, wonderful job. And so Vanessa, when she got back, she was in China at that time, and she was the one who said, because she called me up and said, "So how to go, Dad?" And I said, "Well, Mom's having a hard time with it." And she said, "Well, listen, I'm coming home, and I'd like to go to a counseling session with you and Mom." And so she just said, then she finally talked to Anita, and Anita said, "Listen, I love you and that, but I really got to know, how are you and God?" And Vanessa said, "God and I are just fine. It's people I have a problem with."
Well, that's
And
true for most of us.
yeah. And
now,
so she was having to work through a lot of issues on her own as well. And
it's so, like, this gets down to, like, your issues weren't around, do you love your daughter? Do you respect your daughter? Does she have integrity? Does she have faith? Your issues were, how do I put together some understanding of the gospel in the context of what I have really been raised in, which is very different from what I'm dealing with.
Mhm.
And so if you were to say, what does your faith inform you about a situation now, where it isn't about behavior or morality, it's about identity, where does that all connect for you? And I mean, I think there probably have been some good people and
Yeah.
some unfortunate people, but Vanessa's point is probably true, that she would have felt rejection by the institutions in which she was raised, or would have been concerned that that might have been the case.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, there was a lot of confusion in the beginning, but again, I think, Norm, you recommended another family who had gone through the same kind of a journey. And so they came to see us and started us on this process of just prayer and study and looking at scripture and reading, and that we went through. And I'd have to say that I don't think anybody understands the situation unless they're having to have gone through it, because it's your child that you're dealing with, and trying to understand it and love them through this whole process is tough. And so we joined a support group of Christian families with gay children, who I think really helped us work our way through that process of coming to understand that Vanessa is as loved by God as everybody else, and understanding her orientation. And I was going to say be comfortable with it. That's taken a time, but I am at peace with it. And
because you have a great relationship with her. You and Anita both
yeah,
have
we
been on
do. Yeah.
lots of vacations.
Mm-hmm.
So and she has a great relationship with Serena, as far as I know.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the nice thing. Like, I remember at your mom's funeral a year ago, when the grandkids were up on the stage. Vanessa was very much part of that, and that was in your Finnish Pentecostal church. And I thought that was a wonderful moment,
Mm-hmm.
where both of your daughters were equally accepted to speak on behalf of their grandmother in that context. And so it's pretty, because the interesting thing, and I don't know whether you agree with this, the Bible doesn't actually have a lot to say about people with an identity that's different than just our traditional male female. And so
Mm-hmm.
how we then cope with what do we think being followers of Jesus means about all this is actually a very complex
It
thing.
is a very complex issue, and I've certainly my belief and the way I view scripture, the way I view the teaching that we've gotten, has changed enormously as a result of this.
How so?
I'm very supportive of Vanessa. And I'm proud of what she's done and where she is, and the fact that she had the honesty to come forth with it and be honest about it rather than trying to hide it. And so, I love her as much now as I ever did, but I love her more.
Right. And talk about Serena and Byron, and I forget Serena's husband's name.
Yeah, Andrew. Yeah. Well, listen, there, little Byron is the joy of our life.
He's
I
how old
love.
now?
I'm sorry.
How old is he now?
He's about 2 years, 4 or 5 months, and he's such a joy and a blessing for us. I just love him to pieces, and it's incredibly joyful to be with him and to be with Serena and Andrew just to celebrate this little gift from God.
Now, to talk about your own sort of spiritual journey in your inner journey of conversation with God, your perhaps expanding understanding of your experience with God over the years as we have aged together.
Yeah, it is. It's been a journey. It's been an up and down journey, I have to admit. I think there were a lot of years when I was just completely obsessed with business, where my faith walk really kind of took a bit of a backseat, and I was living a double life in that I work in a very secular kind of a business, and yet at the same time I was attending church. I think I was even on the board of the church at the time, but they were two completely separate things. And there was a time when I really started to have to come to terms with it, and I think I went agnostic for some time, just because I just had so many doubts and so many questions. And I really, one of the big challenges for me was not understanding the love of God. And it was finally, I think it started to sort of break when we went on that weekend retreat, and you gave me some great advice. And
I must
I
have,
spent
whatever
some
I
time.
said must have been translated by the Holy Spirit into something useful. But what
Yeah,
was the advice, and then what was your experience on the
I
retreat?
was I was really questioning God, and you told me just go by myself, and you gave me some readings in that, and he said just. Uh, Go sit somewhere and imagine that you're sitting in your father's lap and you ask him those tough questions, and put out your thoughts. And again, for me, that was one of those incredible moments where I really got to sense and feel and know God differently. And that started a whole new search for me in reading and in viewing scripture and in prayer. And that sort of uh, journey and that searching has gone on ever since. And you give me a bunch of good books to read, which I've gone through, and
I
yeah.
mean, the interesting thing is that you are a widely read person. You think deeply, and you're not afraid to voice doubts and questions. But I've never felt that you were walking away from God by being honest about your doubts and questions. I felt like you were just taking God seriously, and that God could ultimately handle the questions. Would you agree with that, or?
Yeah, very much. I'm a sort of a perpetual doubter and questioner, and my wife rolls her eyes when I start, going down a certain path, and say, "Here we go again." But it is, I would say, it's really the questioning and searching for answers, and finding some answers and not finding some yet, has definitely deepened my faith, and I think honesty is incredibly crucial in this, because I think I was just living in denial for the longest time over some of these issues, and I just refused to face them. And yeah, and so I feel I'm in a very, very different place now than I was even 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I think probably the story I mentioned to the guys on the retreat was one of my learning experiences was when my grandson, who's now 15, was about 18 months old, and I was babysitting him in Vancouver, where Heidi and her husband Mark lived at the time. And it was after supper, and he was scrambling around the house and the townhouse where they lived, and my job was just to keep him from killing himself or whatever. And then he started to slow down, and I kept thinking, there's something about my relationship with him that's like the Heavenly Father's relationship with me. It's given me lots of space, just trying to keep me from doing anything too self-destructive. And anyway, there came a point where Wade was got up on my lap, and we were doing a few things, and he had a beach ball on an elastic band, and he was going like banging it and banging it at high speed and high speed and high speed, and then it just started to slow down, and it slowed down and it slowed down, and his hand hit my lap and his head hit my chest, and he went to sleep.
Mm.
And I thought, what a great picture of what some kinds of prayer are, that our prayer experience is just a lay back on the Father's chest and to experience his love. And in that retreat setting, my recollection is, you not only lay back on the Father's chest, you lay back on a couch down in the bunkie near the lake.
I did.
Son, talk about that experience.
Well, it was one of those. It's the sun was shining, and it was warm there, and I was sort of reclined on the couch, and I was imagining myself sitting in my father's lap, who I sort of, just that visual that I had in front of me, but realizing it was God, and being open and honest, and then slowly sort of drifting off for a nap.
And then when you woke up,
Yeah.
what happened?
Well, it was just when I woke up, I just had the sense of peace, and that was completely different from before that entire, sort of thing happened before I went into that private time, on that couch.
And one last question, Pekka. You've been married to Anita for 48 years. Now, I've been married coming into my 52nd year, and it's not all been peaches and cream, and it's not all, Susan and I have had lots of opportunities for growth and development. But we would say it's been worth the scraps and the challenges and the difficult times. Talk about 48 years of marriage and the ups and downs and the value of it all to you, and how valuable Anita has been for you to get to this point.
I would say she's been incredibly valuable. We've had our differences like all married couples do, and I would say that she's been that side of me that was really lacking. And her sensitivity and her just sort of intuition and her wisdom during these difficult times really has just, sort of sustained me. And I look at it now and said I would have been a very, very different self-centered person, had I not married Anita and just sort of lived through these tough times together. Probably one of the things that comes to mind is that moment when you had mentioned these 87, 88, 89, the recession, when things got very, very difficult, and our company had to declare bankruptcy, and consequently I had all kinds of covenants on lines of credit and that, and I ended up having to go bankrupt myself, and I had to unburden it all on Anita, and she said, you know what, just know that I love you and your kids love you, and that's the important part. I said, listen, we'll work our way through this, and if we have to live simpler, we'll do that. And so she just had that sort of rock solid stability that I lacked during that time, that just really helped me get through an incredibly difficult time in my life.
Any other things you'd like to add before I'd make a couple of closing comments?
No, I think that's about it.
Okay.
I think we've covered a fair bit of ground.
Well, Pekka, thank you very much for taking the time to do this. Pekka has been a great friend to me personally, has been a great stimulus by his questions and his wisdom as he has explored them. Thank you for watching this video with us. We hope you enjoy it, and we trust that some of the things that Pekka has talked about might actually encourage you in your own journey in business, in family, amongst friendships, and that you might be able to sit quietly in the Father's lap, put your head back on his chest, and sense the breath of God in your life and experience his peace and his power and his hope as he is revealed in Jesus Christ. So thanks for being with us. And we hope one day we'll have another one of these podcasts.